Welcome to our podcast. I'm Jonna Monahan from Women's Platform, and this is the third episode of our series looking at international human rights frameworks and what they really mean in Northern Ireland perspective. Today we're looking at intersectionality, and we have Alexa Moore from Rainbow Project and Pirkko Mahlamäki from European Disability Forum and European Women's Lobby.
Hiya.
Hello.
And we're really looking at how can the international frameworks integrate the whole idea of diversity. They don't mention it, but it is implicit in it. And for example, the CEDAW committee has been very clear that they are wanting to integrate it as effectively as possible. And our first question, what would an inclusive human rights framework look like to you?
So human rights in Northern Ireland are really quite central to everything that we do here. Obviously, the Good Friday Agreement brought with it a certain kind of gamut of human rights frameworks alongside the Human Rights Act. And we were obviously promised a Bill of Rights in that agreement in 1998, which would have kind of incorporated a lot more of those international human rights frameworks. And I suppose that the intersectionality comes in when they all kind of interlink and work together to protect everyone in our society. So, you know, the human rights are not a static document or not a static framework. They're constantly changing, and you know, the previous Conservative government was really quite angry at that. But I personally think it's actually quite a good thing that human rights evolves and expands in scope and broadens out depending on the emergent issues of the day. So, you know, trans people or queer people more broadly aren't directly referenced in international human rights frameworks. And it's really important that those frameworks actually do evolve to meet the needs of those populations. I mean, if I'm thinking about what kind of intersectional frameworks look like, I'm thinking about things like the Yogyakarta Principles, which were essentially a set of guidelines developed to sit on top of international human rights frameworks to kind of govern how they would apply to trans and gender diverse communities. They're not necessarily taken as seriously as the frameworks themselves. And so if you're asking kind of what would it look like if that was done well, I suppose it would look like an actual meaningful investment in realising the Yogyakarta Principles and in kind of expanding, taking that approach to other groups and kind of intersecting groups and expanding them across all human rights frameworks. For context, the Yogyakarta Principles are kind of, it was Yogyakarta plus 10. They basically set out how trans and gender diverse people interact with and kind of can engage with international human rights frameworks, how they can apply to trans people. And so, you know, if you look more broadly at sex workers, at other marginalised queer identities, at intersex people, and so on and so forth, you can start to see that those principles are actually a framework for how we can make the wider framework of human rights more inclusive and more intersectional.
Yeah, and if I may add, there's also the fact that these principal documents like the Yogyakarta also, I remember we had in the disability movement before we had the UN Convention, which is basically a reaffirmation that all the existing UN conventions also fully apply and fully include disabled people as part of the human community and human diversity. Before that, we had something which is called the standard rules, which then became like the next step was to get a legally binding international human rights convention, which in itself is somehow strengthening or reaffirming or taking a step to the next level. But the principles in themselves are very good at creating the kind of awareness within society and also kind of willingness to see that we need to see people not in one dimensional lens but through different facets of their identities, that they are not only the one thing that creates a minority status, but there might be different statuses that interact and create a compounding situation of exclusion, for example, from society or negative prejudices. So my sort of number one issue would then be to have a framework that fully says it out loud that we are not one-dimensional, that there are different situations, different roles, different ages, different life situations. I like very much the life course approach, because we would also need to look at young people, look at older people in the sort of the whole range of human experience, and also obviously the rights of women and girls as one half of us all. So that's important.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's is the main issue around the whole concept of intersectionality. None of us are one dimensional. We all have multiple identities. And that's the
Yeah.
whole idea that we need to look at things in that light. My next question is, what changes are needed? And I think you've answered that already, but in terms of rights frameworks, what do we need to achieve?
Well, as a lawyer, I would say that what we need are strong international documents outlining clearly state party public duty objectives and monitoring and implementation structures, and have a full participation and inclusion of the minorities that are considered needy of protection or special measures. So this participation, inclusion, being fully included in the monitoring, in the realization, in the national implementation, in the reporting back, in the kind of going forward and evolving and going towards improvements in situation for various minorities. That I think is the key: participation, inclusion.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think kind of further to that, I think something that would maybe enable a bit more of that participation and more fruitful kind of scrutiny of state parties is if the individual conventions and individual committees flowed and worked a bit better together.
More.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Often you can kind of think of,
Yeah.
UNCRPD, the kind of Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and UNCRC on the Rights of the Child, and UNCERD on
CEDAW.
racial discrimination, on CEDAW. They're all their own little silos. They're all their own little fiefdoms. They scrutinise the state parties on an individual basis on a kind of 4 or 5 year cycle, and they'll talk to each other, but they won't really actually meaningfully.
Actually, I would rather bring a little bit argue in favor of a more positive view, because I think the committees have recently started working together, bringing out joint declaration, joint statements on some issues, including the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the CEDAW committee, and the Disability Committee. And also they are reaching out more to highlight these intersectional situations. And this is something that is maybe starting, but I see it starting and I see it as a very important development. But it's something that we need to do more. And in particular, highlighting the CRPD, what's different in there and what should be included there. The participation of the disability movement and those representing the disability movement, even in the implementation monitoring, was considered as vital in order to ensure that the voice of the disability movement would be fully included in those procedures. So the participation aspect was very much enhanced, especially as the convention itself states that the disability representatives shall be involved. It's an obligation for us not only the states, it's an obligation for the disability community. And that is a novelty in a framework like this, in a convention framework.
And I absolutely agree. I think it is. It's happening more often these days, but I think we can always go further
Yeah,
with that.
we need to push forward with it.
I
Yes,
think your point on
indeed.
that kind of engagement and inclusion and kind of meaningful participation of the people who are affected by
Yeah,
these kind of human rights frameworks is really important because, myself and Jonna went to CEDAW in 2019, but I found it really quite almost archaic in terms of how NGOs, non-government organizations, and kind of organizations who maybe weren't the likes of the NI Human Rights Commission or the Equality Commission or whatever, the way that our engagement and our participation in the review was so much less formalized. We were asked to give a presentation to the committee members like over their lunch. They could choose whether or not to attend. They could, they had all of this scope to just not listen to kind of civil society organizations. And it sounds like what you say about the UNCRPD having that specific clause in it that says disabled peoples and their organizations must be included in this process. I think the rest of the conventions would probably benefit from that as well. And, I think that back to the kind of original scope of the question, how do we improve it? I think obviously I would love a UN convention on the rights of LGBTI persons. I think it would be great. UN SOGI, it's right there. But I also don't think that we need to create a new convention every time there's a new emerging human rights issue or kind of emerging community of marginalized people. I think that we can already apply pre-existing conventions with a bit of thought and with a bit of engagement with those communities and a kind of, developing something like the Yogyakarta Principles or something like that.
And I think some of that has been happening. So, for example, CEDAW and CRPD work together on issues around abortion and things like that.
Exactly.
And we're trying in this podcast series to bring it back to the sort of everyday level. So what would better implementation of that look like at local level, Northern Ireland level, national level?
I think it would be best if the organizations representing like disability organization, disability movement and the LGBTIQA movement, that you have these contacts, that you work together in the more general, like the universal periodic reviews or CEDAW reports or Beijing plus 30 processes that exist, that you already work together and formulate positions together and also be solidar in that you come together to the table expressing, for example, solutions in a similar vein or sharing good practices, learning to talk to one another, raising awareness about specific issues, specific human rights infringements, what is happening that needs to be highlighted, where you need to raise awareness and be in solidarity together, for example, in terms of changes in criminal law, prosecutions, what is considered, how the systems can be woken up to these issues better. And also to educate the people who are in the human rights systems, whose everyday work is actually to ensure the support frameworks that people need in order to be able to exercise and make full benefit and use of their rights. For example, social services, healthcare professionals, doctors, the professional bodies that you need to bring to this coalition together.
I think you're 100% right. And I think that we kind of, in the UK and in Northern Ireland, we have through the Human Rights Act, through other pieces of legislation, we've kind of
Exactly.
embedded a lot of that into, those areas that you're talking about, health and social care and education and so on and so forth. But I think the problem is that a lot of people view that, and I know people who work in social care, I know people who work in healthcare, and a lot of them view that as just more bureaucracy. They don't necessarily actually see it as bringing the benefits that it should do, because maybe it's not seen as a key part of the work. This is the work, and here's their human rights obligations that they have to fill out a form, or they have to do X, Y, and Z to make sure that rights aren't infringed on. But they think of it almost as a kind of separate and really onerous requirement on them. But I don't think it needs to be that. And I think with a bit of education and reframing how we think about this and how we talk about this and how we educate in our schools around human rights and so on and so forth, I think you can actually do that a bit better. And what you were saying about all of these different communities and movements coming together is really important as well, because, at CEDAW in 2019, there was, I think I was one of the only LGBTI people or organisations represented at the kind of UK review, and there was another sex worker led organisation that was also the only sex worker led organisation represented at the review, and we kind of really engaged quite strongly together because we were some of the smaller groups in the room to kind of to reinforce each other's asks and make our kind
That's
of
what I meant.
yeah.
That positive reinforcement, that clarification of potentially shared ways forward, that would be very beneficial in the way of having a successful advocacy work. And also to notice that the formal structures within the UN, within the European structures, they have become somehow a little bit calcified or ossified or not fragmented, but like it's getting old and it's getting a little bit creaky.
Rigid almost. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
and we
almost
need to find new ways to wake up their full potential again.
absolutely. I have to bring it back to the Bill of Rights. It has to come back to the Bill of Rights because, what does human rights look like locally? It looks like the Bill of Rights. And that should be a really engaging process in developing that. Well, we should have had it 20 odd years ago, but sure, we'll not talk about that. We'll be positive and optimistic. I think that we have a real opportunity with the Bill of Rights to, in its development, one, to incorporate a lot of those international human rights mechanisms that we're talking about right now that maybe aren't kind of incorporated and fully realised in Northern Ireland. But two, we have an opportunity to bring society with us in terms of, okay, well, why do we need the incorporation of these human rights? Kind of link it back to the actual issues that people are facing every single day, the massive cuts to benefits, the crumbling public infrastructure, the lack of access to healthcare, bring it back to all of those things that people, education and kind of discrimination in education and not coming out of education with a kind of quality of learning. I think we have to link it back to all of the things that people actually care about, because realistically, and I put this in heavy quotations, normal people, quote unquote, aren't going to be listening to a human rights frameworks podcast, and I love everyone who would be listening to a human rights frameworks podcast. I would be listening to a human rights frameworks podcast, but we have to reach beyond that as well.
The disability community has I'm wondering if I can say, but for the disability community to talk to the non-disability community, there's always the general fear or apprehension that there but the grace of God go I. And there can be a situation in life where you suddenly find ourselves in our side of the
Absolutely.
world.
Absolutely.
But I know it's challenging because on the one hand, you don't want to create a fear atmosphere. You want to create an opportunity atmosphere, a positive atmosphere.
That is so uplifting and positive to hear. I think what you have managed to do is to make it sound that this can be done. And I have so many questions, but we will come back to this another day. Thank you so much, Alexa. Thank you so much, Pirkko. Thank you for listening to us. Our next episode will look at gender budgeting as a way of actually financing human rights in practice. Thank you.
That would be great. I will be listening.